One of the most fully ascertained and abundantly witnessed modern instances of a haunted house is that exemplified in the strange case of Ballechin House, Perthshire, duly set forth in a substantial volume entitled The Alleged Haunting of B House. The Stewart family, who owned the estate, had been in possession since the 16th century. At the time when the owner, Captain Stewart, let the mansion and the shooting for the season in August 1896 to a wealthy family, the house already had the reputation of being haunted. But this repute had not been made known to the world at large and was only a matter of local gossip. It, however, acquired a wider notoriety when, after a residence of some 7 weeks, the tenants who had intended to remain for months were driven from the place by the supernatural sights and sounds that constantly disturbed them. Ballechin House had been the property and the residence of Major Stewart from 1834 to 1876 when he died. The old Major, as he is still known at Ballechin, appears to have been a very eccentric person. He had a profound belief in spirits and spoke frequently of his own intention to return after death. He was very fond of dogs and kept a large number of them in and about the house, and often declared his belief in the transmigration of souls and his intention of making his post-mortem reappearance in the body of a particularly favorite black spaniel. These oft-repeated intentions so greatly impressed his relatives and heirs that when the Major died in 1876, they took especial care that all his dogs, 14 in number, not forgetting the black spaniel, should immediately be shot. But the mere execution of these unfortunate dogs does not seem to have been sufficient. The house, like most houses in the Highlands, had the reputation of being haunted even before the Major's time, and a former governess of the family, in 1893, told a priest who told Lord Bute that within 4 years of the Major's death so many people complained of queer noises in the house that she got alarmed and left. This had the more effect on the priest that the year before he had himself slept at Ballechin House for 9 nights and had been disturbed almost nightly by loud and inexplicable noises, the only ones that he specifies being the ordinary spirit raps, an explosive sound, and a noise like that of a calf or big dog falling against the outside of his room door. This experience he also confided to Lord Bute, who, after consulting with Sir William Huggins, wrote to the then-owner suggesting that a phonograph should be placed in the rooms in question to decide whether the noises were real or fancied. In 1896, another owner succeeded to Ballechin, and the house and shooting were let to Mr. Harrison, a gentleman who is described as of Spanish origin. Their experience was of such a nature that they abandoned the house at the end of 7 weeks, thus forfeiting the greater part of their rent, which had been paid in advance. These facts then came to the notice of the Marquis of Bute, who was keenly interested in spiritualism and was a member of the Psychical Research Society. He conceived the idea of the question being thoroughly examined, and to that end he, in conjunction with Colonel Le Mesurier Taylor and other members of the Society, hired Ballechin House for the express purpose of an inquiry being conducted on the spot. Colonel Taylor was at this time much occupied by the illness and death of a near relative, and was unable for the moment to take up residence at Ballechin House. Lord Bute accordingly expressed a hope that Ada Goodrich-Freer would undertake to conduct the investigation. Miss Freer, a psychic investigator, was a medium, clairvoyant, psychical researcher, and author who published much of her work under the pseudonym Miss X. Miss Freer had dabbled in the supernatural from her childhood, her first occult experience having taken place when she was 3 years old. She claimed to have seen a full-blown ghost in Hampton Court Palace and chronicled many theories on the subject of haunted houses. Hence she was clearly the right person in the right place, and the secretary to the Society for Psychical Research was no doubt well inspired when he wrote to her, urging her to go down to Ballechin and adding, "If you don't get phenomena, probably no one will." She eagerly accepted the invitation. Miss Freer, accompanied by her close friend Miss Constance Moore, a daughter of the Reverend Daniel Moore, chaplain to the Queen, arrived at Ballechin House on February 3, 1897. With that introduction out of the way, we now present the alleged haunting of Ballechin House in the words of the participants. The Times of London, June 8, 1897, from a correspondent.
On the trail of a ghost. Lord Bute's confidence has been grossly abused by someone. It was represented to him by someone that he was taking the most haunted house in Scotland, a house with an old and established reputation for mysterious, if not supernatural, disturbances. What he has got is a house with no reputation whatever of that kind, with no history, with nothing germane to his purpose, beyond a cloud of baseless rumours produced during the last 12 months. Who is responsible for the imposture it is not my business to know or to inquire, but that it is an imposture of the most shallow and impudent kind, there can be no manner of doubt. I interviewed in Perth a man who has the district at his fingertips, and was ready to enumerate in order all the shooting properties in the valley. He had never heard until the moment I spoke to him of Ballechin possessing any reputation, ancient or modern, for being haunted, although he is familiar with the estate and has slept in the house. It has no local reputation of the kind even now beyond the parish it stands in. The whole thing has been fudged up in London upon the basis of some distorted account of the practical jokes of the Harrisons. An intelligent gardener whom I questioned told me that he had kept watch in the house on 2 separate occasions, abstaining from sleep until daylight appeared at 7 o'clock, but without hearing a sound. A caretaker, who had spent months in the house, and who had to keep a stove alight all night, never heard a sound, probably because there was no one to make any. The only mystery in the matter seems to be the mode in which a prosaic and ordinary dwelling was endowed with so evil a reputation. I was assured in London that it had had this reputation for 20 or 30 years. The family lawyer in Perth asserted most positively that there had never been a whisper of such a thing until the house was let for last year's shooting season to a family called the Harrisons. I was told the same thing in equally positive terms by the minister of the parish, a level-headed man from Berkshire, who has lived in the place for 20 years. He told me that some of the younger members of the Harrison family had indulged in practical jokes and boasted of them. If there are really any noises not referable to ordinary domestic causes, it is not improbable that these practical jokers made a conspirator of someone about the estate who amuses himself by occasionally repeating their tricks. The steward or factor on the estate concurs with the lawyer and the minister in denying that the house had any reputation for being haunted before the advent of the Harrison family. Yet he is a Highlander, and not without superstition, for he gave it as his opinion that if there was anything in these noises, they must be due to black art. Asked what black art might be, he said he could not tell, but he had often heard about it, and had been told that when once set going, it would go on without the assistance of its authors. He was quite clear, however, that if there is black art, it came in with the Harrison family.
The Times of London letter to the editor, June 10th, 1897.
Sir, in your issue of the 8th, a correspondent tries at some length to describe what he calls a most impudent imposture. I, having lived at Ballechin for 3 months in the autumn of last year as butler to the house, I thought perhaps my experience of the ghost of Ballechin might be of interest to many of your readers. On July 15, 1896, I was sent by Mr. Harrison with 2 maidservants to take charge of Ballechin from Mr. Stewart's agents. I was there 3 days before the arrival of any one of the family, and during that time I heard nothing to disturb me in any way. But on the morning after the arrival of 2 of the family, Master and Miss Harrison, they came down with long faces, giving accounts of ghostly noises they had heard during the night, but I tried to dissuade them from such nonsense, as I then considered it to be. But on the following 2 or 3 nights, the same kind of noises were heard by them, and also by the maidservants, who slept in the rooms above, and they all became positively frightened. I heard nothing whatever, though the noises, as they described them, would have been enough to wake anyone much farther away than where I slept, for the noises they heard were made immediately over my room. I suggested the hot water pipes or the twigs of ivy knocking against the windows, but no, nothing would persuade them but that the house was haunted. As the noises continued to be heard nightly, I suggested that I should sit up alone and without a light outside their bedroom doors, where the footsteps and other rustling noises were heard. I took my post on the landing at 11:30 and kept watch, I am certain, until 1:30. Then I must have fallen asleep, for about 2 o'clock, Master Harrison, hearing the knocking as usual, came out of his room to hear if I had seen or heard anything. He found me fast asleep on the floor, which gave him a greater fright than the knocking, for he supposed for the moment that I had been slain by the ghost. This kind of thing went on nightly, and for 3 weeks I heard nothing. I only laughed at the others for their absurd nonsense, as I then considered it to be. But my first experience was that of being awakened 3 successive mornings at about 3:30. I heard nothing but seemed to be wide awake in an instant, as though someone had touched me. I would stay awake for some little time and then go to sleep again. But on the 4th night, on being awakened, as before, and lying awake for perhaps 2 minutes, I heard tremendous thumping just outside my door. I jumped out of bed quickly and opened my door and called out in a loud voice, "Who is there?" but got no answer. I ascended the stairs and listened for a few minutes, but heard no further knocking. The same thing happened with variations almost nightly for the succeeding 2 months that I was there, and every visitor that came to the house was disturbed in the same manner. One gentleman, a colonel, told me he was awakened on several occasions with the feeling that someone was pulling the bedclothes off him. Sometimes heavy footsteps were heard, at others like the rustling of a lady's dress, and sometimes groans were heard, but nearly always accompanied with heavy knocking. Sometimes the whole house would be aroused. When watching, I always experienced a peculiar sensation a few minutes before hearing any noise. I can only describe it as like suddenly entering an ice house, and a feeling that someone was present and about to speak to me. But the worst night I had at Ballechin was one night about the 2nd week in September, and I shall never forget it as long as I live. I had seated myself on the service stairs, close to where the water pipes passed up the wall, so as to decide once and for all if the sounds came in any way from the water pipes. I had not long to wait when the knocking recommenced from the same direction as before, but much louder than before, followed after a very short interval by 2 distinct groans, which certainly made me feel very uncomfortable, for it sounded like someone being stabbed and then falling to the floor. That was enough for me. I went and asked 2 gentlemen who had just gone to bed if they had heard anything. One said he had heard 5 knocks and 2 groans, the same as I had, while the other, whose room was much nearer to where the sounds came from, said he had heard nothing. I then retired to my bed, but not to sleep, for I had not been in bed 3 minutes before I experienced the sensation as before. But instead of being followed by knocking, my bedclothes were lifted up and let fall again first, at the foot of my bed, but gradually coming towards my head. This was immediately followed by my being fanned as though some bird was flying around my head, and I could distinctly hear and feel something breathing on me. Then the thing seemed to retire to the foot of my bed. Then I suddenly found the foot of my bed lifted up and carried around towards the window for about 3 or 4 feet, then replaced to its former position. Just then the clock struck 4, and being tired out with my long night's watching, I fell asleep. There are many other incidents in my experience with the mystery of Ballechin, but I hope this is sufficient for the purpose I intend it, namely, for the truth to be known, for I have no other motive in writing this letter, for I have left the service of the house some months now. But as to your correspondent's statement that some of the house were doing it, it is simply absurd. If anyone had been doing it, I should certainly have caught them. And I can assure you that the house were very much annoyed with it, not only for themselves but for their visitors. Thanking you, dear sir, in anticipation of your inserting this letter, I remain your obedient servant, Harold Sanders, Chidcock, near Bridport, Dorset.
The Times of London, June 11th, 1897. Letter from Mr. Harrison.
To the editor of The Times. Sir, I must ask you to be good enough to publish, on behalf of the tenant of Ballechin, a few remarks on the article that appeared in your paper of the 8th instant, with the heading, "On the Trail of a Ghost." The writer of that article finds a very easy solution to the mystery by attacking a private family who happened to be tenants of Ballechin for a short time and making them a scapegoat for his argument. I do not quite understand if your correspondent pretends to assert that the place had not the reputation of being haunted previous to my tenancy for 3 months last year. Probably he does not charge me with originating such reports, as he mentions a story of the visit of a Catholic archbishop to the house to exorcise the ghost. This must have happened some time ago, and proves that the house was then supposed to be haunted. What your correspondent does state as a fact is that the younger members of my family played practical jokes, which have given rise to Lord Bute's investigations. My object in writing to you is to deny most emphatically this statement. The principal proof that is brought forward to corroborate this slander is that the doors are marked by the blows struck to produce the noises heard. Surely no one could be frightened after the cause and reason of the noises were once ascertained by the boot marks. But there were no such marks on the doors when we left Ballechin. Some of our guests were with us until very shortly before my family left, and can testify to this, for the good reason that in the endeavour to localise the extraordinary noises, all doors and other parts of the house were constantly examined up to the very last. When I went to Ballechin at the beginning of August, my family had already been there a few days, and at once they told me they had found out the house was supposed to be haunted, and that they had heard most unaccountable noises. I had the greatest difficulty to persuade all my people to stay in the place, and after all, we left Scotland about the end of September, 2 months earlier than usual. I personally did not give any importance to the rumours that Ballechin House is haunted, and attributed the very remarkable noises heard to the hot water pipes and the peculiar way in which the house is built. In fact, I have to confess I cannot believe in ghosts, and consequently, I did my best to persuade everybody that Ballechin was not haunted, but I am afraid I was not always successful. I hope you will forgive me for taking up so much valuable space in your paper, but I had to do so in self-defense against a false accusation. Yours faithfully, Harrison.
February 3rd, Wednesday. Constance Moore and I arrived from Edinburgh with Mackintosh, the maid, a little after 10 p.m, having sent on beforehand the following servants: Robinson and wife, butler and cook, Carter and Hannah, 2 housemaids. They had all good characters and were well recommended. We told them nothing, of course, of the reputation of the house and were careful to choose persons of mature age and not excitable girls. The house looked very gloomy. It was not cold out of doors, though thick snow lay on the ground. Inside, it felt like a vault, having been empty for months. None of the stores ordered had arrived. We had no linen, knives, plate, wine, food, and very little fuel or oil. Candles and bread and milk and a tin of meat had been got for us in the village. We ate and went to bed. The room was so cold that we had to cover our faces, and we had no bed linen. We had been very busy all day in Edinburgh and soon fell asleep. February 4th, Thursday. I awoke suddenly, just before 3 a.m. Miss Moore, who had been lying awake over 2 hours, said, "I want you to stay awake and listen." Almost immediately I was startled by a loud clanging sound which seemed to resound through the house. The mental image it brought to my mind was as of a long metal bar, such as I have seen near iron foundries, being struck at intervals with a wooden mallet. The noise was distinctly as of metal struck with wood. It seemed to come diagonally across the house. It sounded so loud, though distant, that the idea that any inmate of the house should not hear it seems ludicrous. It was repeated with varying degrees of intensity at frequent intervals during the next 2 hours, sometimes in single blows, sometimes double, sometimes treble, latterly continuous. About 8 a.m, the maid brought us some tea. She said she had slept very badly, had worried over our apparent restlessness, as she had heard voices and footsteps, and the sound of things dragged about, but that the maids had not been downstairs. We had never risen, and had spoken seldom, and in low tones, and an empty room, the dressing room, intervened between Mac's room and ours. The whole day has been occupied with exploring the house, sending for food and supplies, trying to thaw the rooms, moving furniture to make things homelike, and trying to arrive at a little comfort. The house will soon be very pleasant, and only needs living in, but it feels like a vault. It is very roomy and very light. Nothing less like the conventional haunted house could be conceived. The main body of the house was built in 1806, the wing about 1883, with the apparent object of providing the children of the family with rooms outside the haunted area. It is cheerful, sunny, convenient, healthy, and built on a very simple plan, which admits of no dark corners or mysteries of any kind. A pleasanter house to live in I would not desire, but it is constructed for summer rather than for winter use. It has been added to at least twice, and there is much waste space. The original mansion, which was, I understand, upon a different site, was dated 1579. The new wing was built about 14 years ago and consists of 4 rooms and offices, adapted for schoolroom or nursery use. But the older walls are of great thickness. February 5th, Friday. Miss Moore and I slept well. We were both desperately tired. The maids tell me that they heard the sounds below them of continuous speaking or reading and supposed the young ladies were reading to one another. February 6th, Saturday. No phenomena last night. The house perfectly still. In the afternoon, an experiment was made with the apparatus known as a Ouija board, and this, as is very often the case, resolved itself after a time into automatic writing. There is in the library a portrait of a very handsome woman, to which no name is attached, but which shows the costume of the last century. Her name was asked, and the word Ishbel was given several times. It is not certain whether this word was meant as an answer to the question, or whether, as often happens in such cases, it was intended merely as an announcement of the name of the informant supposed to communicate. The name Margaret was revealed by automatic writing. We decided to walk in the avenue and to explore Scamp's Copse before dinner. Miss Moore took the dog off in the opposite direction, and we walked in silence to the plantation. It was quite dark, but the snow gleamed so white that we could see our way to the plantation. We went up among the trees, young firs. The snow was deep and untrodden, and when we got well off the road, we found that a burn comes down the brae side. It is frozen hard. We walked on in silence. In a few minutes I saw what made me stop. The men stopped too, and we all stood leaning over the railings and looking in silence across the burn to the steep bank opposite. This was white with snow, except to the left, where the boughs of a large oak tree had protected the ground. Against the snow I saw a slight black figure, a woman moving slowly up the glen. She stopped and turned and looked at me. She was dressed as a nun. Her face looked pale. I saw her hand in the folds of her habit. Then she moved on, as it seemed, on a slope too steep for walking. When she came under the tree, she disappeared, perhaps because there was no snow to show her outline. I described what I had seen. The others saw nothing.
In a letter sent to Lord Bute later in the investigation, Miss Freer provided a detailed description of the figure, which by that time had been associated with a sister of Major Stuart, Isabella, who became a nun. It is important to note that a native Gaelic speaker might pronounce Isabella as Ishbel.
As you know, these figures do not appear before 6:30 at earliest, therefore there is little light upon their surface. Like other phantasms seen at dark, they show by their own light, i.e., they appear to be outlined by a thread of light. It is therefore only when the face appears in profile that one can describe the features, and this is somewhat prevented by the nun's veil. Ishbel appears to me to be slight and of fair height. I am unable, of course, to see the colour of her hair, but I should describe her as dark. There is an intensity in her gaze which is rare in light-coloured eyes. The face, as I see it, is in mental pain, so that it is perhaps hardly fair to say that it seems lacking in that repose and gentleness that one looks for in the religious life. Her dress presents no peculiarities. The habit is black, with the usual white about the face, and I have thought that when walking she showed a lighter underdress. She speaks upon rather a high note, with a quality of youth in her voice. Her weeping seemed to me passionate and unrestrained. February 8th, Monday. Last night my maid heard footsteps and the sound of hands fumbling on her door. This she told us when she came in with our early tea. I had been disturbed about 5:30 a.m. by the sound described by former witnesses as explosive. I know of nothing quite like it. I have heard the Portsmouth guns when at a place 8 miles away. The sound was like that, but did not convey the same impression of distance. We went out at dusk, having sent Mr. Macpherson and Mr. Calloway to pay a visit, as they had not been told of the brook scene, intending that the same trio as before should go to the copse. Mr. F and I went on alone. We met Mr. Macpherson and Mr. Calloway returning before they were expected. On the spur of the moment, I asked Mr. Calloway to come with me, leaving Mr. F and Mr. Macp in the avenue. The snow had gone, and I saw less distinctly. But I saw the nun again, and an older woman in grey who talked earnestly with her, she answering at intervals. I could hear no words. The ice was giving, and the brook had begun to babble. February 9th, Tuesday. Last night, Miss Moore and I heard the explosive noises about 11:30 p.m. and speculated as to the possibility of their being caused by the wind in the chimney. There was a little wind last night, very little. It is worth mentioning that ever since we have been here, the air has been phenomenally still. One can go outside, as we do frequently, to feed the birds and squirrels without hats and not feel a hair stirred. Even when the snow was on the ground, we never felt the cold, owing to the absence of wind, and the thaw has been imperceptible. I have several times thrown open my bedroom window about dawn for an hour to familiarise myself with the outside noises. There is nothing human within a quarter of a mile. February 14th, Sunday. Our first wet day. The weather so far has been perfect. We all got very wet coming from church. In the evening we did various experiments, thought transference, crystal gazing, etc., but nothing came of it in regard to the house. February 16th, Tuesday. I had an experience this morning which may have been purely subjective, but which should be recorded. About 10 a.m. I was writing in the library, face to light, back to fire. Mrs. W. was in the room and addressed me once or twice. But I was aware of not being responsive, as I was much occupied. I wrote on and presently felt a distinct but gentle push against my chair. I thought it was the dog and looked down, but he was not there. I went on and in a few minutes felt a push, firm and decided, against myself which moved me on my chair. I thought it was Mrs. W. who, having spoken and received no answer, was reminding me of her presence. I looked back with an exclamation. The room was empty. She came in directly and called my attention to the dog, who was gazing intently from the hearthrug at the place where I had expected, before, to see him. I went to the copse at dusk. The moon was bright, and the twilight lingered. We waited about in the avenue to let it get darker, but it was still far from dark when we made our way up the glen. I saw Ishbel and Marget in the old spot across the burn. Ishbel was on her knees in the attitude of weeping, Marget apparently reasoning with her in a low voice, to which Ishbel replied very occasionally. I could not hear what was said for the noise of the burn. We waited for perhaps 10 or 15 minutes. They had appeared when I had been there, perhaps 3 or 4. When we regained the avenue, in silence, Miss Moore asked Miss Langton, "What did you see?" She said, "I saw nothing, but I heard a low talking." Questioned further, she said it seemed close behind. She is less suggestible than almost anyone I know. February 18th, Thursday. This afternoon, Miss Langton experimented with Ouija. Lord Bute had suggested various test questions in relation to the phantasm of the nun, to be asked the next time the Ouija board was in operation, and answers to these were attempted at various times, with the usual result of showing the influence, conscious or subconscious, of the sitters, almost all statements as to matters not actually known to them being worthless. February 22nd, Monday. Miss Langton went up the glen with Mr. Garford and was perplexed by seeing the grey figure when looking for the nun. She saw it but dimly, but later in the evening recovered it in the crystal, more clearly and in greater detail. February 26th, Friday. Nothing happened till I was in the drawing room in the evening, when I was, as usual since my accident, taking my meal alone. A screen stood between my sofa and the door, so that it was impossible to see who entered. I saw the shadow of a woman on the wall and supposed it to be a maid come to see after the fire. Next, the figure of an old woman emerged from behind the screen. She was of average height and stout. She wore a woolen cap, and her dress was that of a superior servant indoors. Supposing her to be some servant's visitor come to have a look at the drawing room while the party were at dinner, I moved to attract her attention, with no result. She walked a few steps towards the middle of the room, then disappeared. Her countenance was not pleasing, but expressed no personal malevolence. Her face may have been coarsely handsome. Her dress was dark and made in the fashion which was worn in my childhood. When the dog came in later, he seemed to sight something from behind the screen and followed it across the room, when he lay down under my couch instead of on the hearth as usual. March 1st, Monday. We had had a promise from Ouija on Sunday that if Mr. Endell were to visit the copse with me after 6:30, he would be touched on the left shoulder. He was told to go to the farther side of the burn and to stand under the sapling, which is at some little distance from the spot where the phantasm usually appears. This we accordingly did.
Mr. Endell's separately recorded account, dated March 5th, exactly agrees with this, but adds some additional touches to the latter part.
At Miss Freer's suggestion, I fetched Miss Langton, telling her nothing of what had occurred, but merely that we were trying an experiment, and she was to report what she saw. I stood again under the sapling. This time I began to shudder almost immediately. It was so dark. They told me that they could only see my collar, though I was only 10 yards from them. Miss Langton said that 30 seconds after I had taken up my position, the figure appeared behind me a little to my left and seemed to raise its arm. Miss Freer said it was waiting for me and touched me as before. I felt no touch throughout, only shiverings that seemed to coincide with appearances.
March the 2nd, Tuesday. Miss Nichols passed a very disturbed night. She went to bed about 12 o'clock. She is habitually an exceptionally good sleeper and has never had an experience of any sort. She lay awake in discomfort till 3 a.m. and then sought refuge with Miss Langton. The following is the record of her impressions.
March 4th. You ask me to write exactly what I felt in number 3 when I slept there on March 1st. Well, it is rather difficult to describe. I never felt frightened out of my wits at nothing before, if it was nothing. I certainly saw no shadows or figures, and the only noise I heard was the thud twice, which sounded as if it came from the story below. If I shut my eyes for a minute, I felt as if I was struggling with something invisible, not indigestion, as I never have it. I was so paralysed that I dare not call out to Miss Langton, and lay awake from 12 to 3 without moving. In the morning, of course, I felt I had been a fool to be so silly, and I would go and sleep there again tonight if I had the chance.
March 7th, 1897. Mr. Calloway left early. He has promised to write of any experience last night, as he was gone before we were up. March 8th, Monday. Mr. Calloway's account follows.
It was arranged that Colonel Taylor should occupy number 3 and that I should sleep in number 2. I went to bed about 12, but did not go to sleep at once. I awoke suddenly with the distinct impression that there was someone in the room. I lay still and tried to realise what was in the room, but could not do so. There was no idea of movement in my mind, but still I felt convinced that someone was there. The impression seemed gradually to fade out of my mind after about 7 or 10 minutes, and then I got up and looked at my watch. The time was 4:40 a.m. Shortly after, I thought I heard someone moving about in number 1, which I knew to be unoccupied. I listened, and it seemed to me that someone was moving round 3 sides of the room and then coming back. The movement went on for about 3 or 4 minutes and then stopped, but after a pause of some minutes, it began again. I tried to make out footsteps, but could not do so. The movement was that of a heavy body going round the room, and the floor seemed to shake slightly after the way of old flooring when a heavy man moves about. After going on for some time, the movement stopped, and again, after a pause, began again. On Saturday night, Ouija had said that I was not to be disturbed that night, so I was not expecting.
March 16th, Tuesday. Miss Moore, Miss Langton. The Colonel and I left Ballechin. Miss Moore, Miss Langton and I to return on March 20th. St Andrews, March 19th. I looked into a water bottle tonight to see if I could see anything of what was happening at B. I distinctly saw room number 3, and gradually a figure came into view between the two doors, the figure of a tall woman, dressed in a long clinging robe of grey, and who seemed to be holding something in her hand against the wall at the foot of the bed. This became more distinct, and I saw that it was a cross of dark brown wood, some 12 inches long, I should say. The figure did not appear to move. I seemed to be standing at the door of number 3.
Miss Freer eventually secured assistance of 2 priests and a bishop. All 3 were previously well known to her, and she had a special reason to consider them not only worthy of her esteem and confidence, but, moreover, as taking an instructed and intelligent interest in the subject.
May 1st. I shall have to move the priests. They persist that they are not frightened, but they are both looking shockingly ill and worn, and the Reverend MacDonald is not in a state of health to take liberties with. The Reverend MacLeish sees nothing, but is extraordinarily sensitive, and without any hint from me, declared that he felt the drawing room, wing, and number 7 to be innocent. May 3rd. The general tone of things is disquieting, and new in our experience. Hitherto, in our first occupation, the phenomena affected one as melancholy, depressing and perplexing, but now all, quite independently, say the same thing, that the influence is evil and horrible. The worn faces at breakfast were really a dismal sight. May 6th. Madame Boisseau has had to go suddenly. There has been terrible news for her of this Paris fire. She came into my room very early with her telegram. There was mass said in the ground floor sitting room this morning, and as I knelt facing the window, I saw Ishbel with the grey woman nearer the house than ever before. She looked pensive, but, as compared with last time, much relieved.
This is the last time the figures were seen. The following details are quoted from a letter written by Miss Freer to Lord Bute on this day.
Mass was said this morning in the downstairs room, the altar arranged in front of the window, so that as we knelt, we faced the garden. Suddenly she touched my arm and directed my attention to the window. There I saw a figure standing outside, which I took for the moment for Madame's maid, and thought she had come to call our attention through the window. I was starting up when I perceived that the figure was Ishbel. The black gown, like that worn by the maid, had misled me for the moment. Margay seemed to hover in the background, but she was much less distinct than the other. A minute later we were called away. When the bustle of Madame's hasty departure was over and we had breakfasted, the bishop blessed the house from top to bottom. He sprinkled the rooms with holy water, and especially the doorway leading to the drawing room, where noises have so often been heard. He and the priests had hardly gone when there was a loud bang upon a little table that stands there. It is an old work table, a box on tall, slender legs, and the sound could easily be imitated by lifting the lid and letting it fall smartly. Miss Moore and I are now alone.
So ends the tale of the Ballechin happenings. But to bring the story of Colonel Taylor's tenancy to a conclusion, it may be said that the Secretary of the Society for Psychical Research occupied the house for a few days in Miss Freer's absence, and was of the opinion that nothing supernormal occurred. Then came Lord Bute, who, gentle-hearted and generous though he was himself of the stuff of which seers of visions are made. He read the office for the dead in some of the rooms, and experienced a slight difficulty of utterance and a feeling of hostility, but neither saw nor heard anything out of the way. The person who is unused to what are humorously called the methods of psychical research is no doubt prepared to hear that the phonograph recommended by Sir William Huggins was installed in every room, that a competent sanitary engineer was engaged to investigate the hot water pipes, and that flour was scattered nightly in the passages to ensure that no material footsteps came undetected to reinforce the ghostly ones. None of these precautions were adopted. The absence of the phonographs are passed over by Miss Freer without remark. The hot water pipes are dismissed with Miss Freer's statement that at first they would not work, and that afterwards the water in them was never hot enough to make any noise at all. As for the flower trick, which is at least as old as the Apocrypha, it seems to have occurred to none of the psychical researchers, although it was made use of during the Harrison tenancy, though with what result is, oddly enough, not recorded. But Miss Freer did not by any means go down to Ballechin unequipped. She took with her a crystal for gazing, and Ouija as the talking board or instrument for so-called automatic writing is called, and a conviction that the noises heard by the family of Mr. Harrison were due to practical joking. She also either then or later excogitated a theory of apparitions and the like, which she gives in these words.
The thoughts and affections appear to dwell for a time where they have been already fixed during life, but changes here, including the gradual reunion on the other side, of all those who are loved with those who love them, the advancing dissociation of the mind with things here, and no doubt, the evolution of a different life under different conditions, seem gradually to efface the ties of earthly memory, connecting the feelings with particular spots on earth. Such thoughts not infrequently include repentance, a desire for the remedy of acts of injustice, and an eagerness for the compassion and sympathetic prayers of those whom we call the living.
As for organizing research, she wrote later that she
didn't propose to do anything of the sort. It seemed to me that among several things to be avoided was self-consciousness of any kind, that the natural thing to do was to settle down to a country house life, make it as pleasant as possible, and await events.
The guests, we learn on the same authority, were invited on no special principle, and some of them were not told until after their arrival that the house was supposed to be haunted. Neither guests nor events were long wanting to Miss Freer. Miss Constance Moore was with her from the first. They were followed by Colonel Taylor and others. In all 11 ladies, 21 gentlemen, and a person who afterwards wrote to the Times about it. Of the men other than the Times correspondent, 3, Miss Freer tells us, were soldiers, 3 lawyers, 2 were men of letters, 1 an artist, 2 were in business, 4 were clergy, 1 a physician, and 5 men of leisure. Of these visitors, 17 besides Miss Freer and Miss Moore testify to having heard noises generally at either about 2 or about 5 in the morning. Some of these noises are described as resembling a loud bang on the door of the observer's room, others as the pattering of invisible feet in the room above, others as of a distant explosion, and yet others as of persons reading. As to visions Miss Freer saw in a certain copse, to which she was directed by Ouija to go at dusk, the figure of a nun nearly every evening. After a time, Miss Langton began to see it too, and sometimes they contrived to see it in the house. It was connected by means of the crystal with a sister of Major Stuart, who died a canoness of the Holy Sepulchre, as the costume of this order afterwards turned out to be quite different from that of the vision, and as Miss Freer later came to the opinion that her visions were purely subjective, or, in other words, fanciful, we need waste no further time over this, or over a housemaid who, not to be outdone by her betters, one morning saw half a woman sitting at the foot of her bed. On the whole, the balance of evidence seems to be on the side that mysterious noises really did occur at Ballechin, and we therefore hasten to the rational explanation that these were connected with tremors of the earth. Mr. Edward was the last guest at Ballechin, and arrived the evening before the house was vacated. He afterwards told Lord Bute that he had brought 2 seismic instruments, but that they recorded nothing, and that during the night he heard a sound as of a gun being fired outside the house. The house being within the seismic area seemed so reasonable that Miss Freer at once entered into correspondence with the well-known Professor Milner, with a view to experiment in this direction. The following is from his reply.
May 15th, 1897. I was much interested in your note of the 13th and fancy that the sounds with which you have to deal may be of seismic origin. Such sounds I have often heard, and the air waves, if not the earth waves, can be mechanically recorded. The reason I think that the sounds are seismic is, first, on account of their character, and secondly, because you are in one of the most unstable parts of Great Britain, where between 1852 and 1890, 465 shocks, many with sounds, were recorded. Lady Moncrief, when living at Comrie House in 1844, often heard rumblings and moanings, and such sounds, possibly akin to the Barisal guns of eastern England, often occur without a shake. The mechanism of this production may be due to slight movements on a fault face, and they may be heard, especially in rocky districts, in very many countries.
Miss Freer's reply was an urgent request that machinery and an operator might be at once sent up to Ballechin. Professor Milne replied that delicate instruments, such as he himself employed, could only be used by one other person, but suggested that she should hire from a well-known London firm what are known as Ewing's-type seismometers, adding, "I doubt whether these will record anything but movements to which you are sensible." Miss Freer's designs were frustrated when Captain Stewart, the proprietor, peremptorily forbade the continuance of scientific observation, a remarkable parallel to his father's refusal to permit the use of the phonograph when suggested by Sir William Huggins. For those not acquainted with the phenomenon of Barisal guns, may be referred to an interesting correspondence in the pages of Nature, opened by Professor G.H. Darwin. "In the delta of the Ganges," he says, "dull sounds, more or less resembling distant artillery, are often heard. I have constantly noticed these sounds in the plain of Limburg since 1880. The detonations are dull and distant and are repeated a dozen times or more at irregular intervals. They are usually heard in the daytime when the sky is clear, and especially towards evening after a very hot day. Similar noises are heard on Dartmoor and in some parts of Scotland." But if any reasoning person should prefer the revenant theory of Miss Freer to these simple explanations, to what miserably impotent conclusions does it not lead them? The old-fashioned ghost story, in which the murdered man returns to this world to call down vengeance on his murderer, or the ancestor, to point out hidden treasure to his descendants, had at least some idea of human dignity about it. But how contemptible must be the existence of the modern spirit, who comes back in immaterial shape to his earthly home, only to make unmeaning thumps on the doors.